In this video, we will be exploring some of the strangest, most surprising battle tactics, quirky adventures, political plots, experimental weapons, non-human soldiers, and much, much more. World War I find isn't typically talked about as often as World War II, but it is still absolutely filled with strange, interesting characters and events, odd weapons, military strategies, and missions, so you are truly in for a treat. As always, grab a drink. My choice today is just plain English tea, just like the old boys drank in World War I, and join me as we explore part 2 of the ultimate World War I Iceberg. Link in the description if you would like to check out part 1. The Soldier Who Let Hitler Go is, I think, quite a well-known story or rumor that this man, Private Henry Tandy of the British Army, spared a wounded Hitler, a young Hitler serving in the First World War. And this was when he was in the Bavarian Army as a lance corporal. And the story goes that Henry Tandy, who was apparently well known for like sparing and saving enemy soldiers, especially if they were no threat to him or if they were injured, etc. And the story goes that he saw a young wounded Hitler in battle. He refused to kill him, and Hitler then went on to become the Hitler we obviously all know and definitely don't love. But this story later came about when Hitler saw a painting of this Henry Tandy, and in the painting he was rescuing soldiers. And then Hitler was like, hey, I kind of recognize that guy. He spared my life in World War I. But when Henry Tandy was asked about this, he said that, yeah, I spared many soldiers' lives over the years, but I don't specifically recall sparing this man's life, meaning Hitler's. So it could be true, perhaps, but it also could be a story / anecdote created by Hitler, you know, in order to gin up the image of him being divinely chosen as like a savior for the German people, that even God himself chose to indirectly spare Hitler and save his life during the First World War. There's also some evidence that Hitler wasn't even in this particular area around the time that he was serving, around the time that Henry was there. And so that, I think, further pushes this more towards the sort of myth and legend realm than to actual history. Béla Kiss was an insane story, and this was this Hungarian man who was born in 1877, and he was at the time living in Cinkota in Budapest, or rather near Budapest, and by all accounts he was a fairly likable, fairly handsome man, a hardworking individual who had his own business working with metals. It was mainly tin work, and he was making barrels or tools, etc. And as I said, he was quite well liked by his local area. He was friendly, he liked having a talk with people, he was very approachable, and honestly, just a very great guy. Except there was one small issue. Just one really small, really minor, tiny, barely even matters issue, and that was that he was a secret serial killer. Between 1900 and 1914, he was living in this one place, this property in Cinkota, and throughout most of the years, he was married to this woman named Marie Kiss. Now, fast forward to 1912, Marie cheats on him, and she starts seeing this other man called Paul Bicari. And so, as a completely reasonable response, apparently, to this affair, Béla Kiss kills both of these people and puts their bodies into barrels and fills them with alcohol and other chemicals in order to kind of pickle or preserve these individuals. And these become his first 2 known victims, which we're not entirely sure for certain if these were his first 2 victims, because it is thought with a psycho like this that he may have been killing people for years. But in terms of this time period, in this particular area, in the bodies that were later found, these were the first 2 victims. But after this happened, he basically told his neighbors that, you know, his wife had cheated on him and she had run off to America with this bloody man, and that it was a sad affair. They all took sympathy on him, and so now as a single man, he would often date women, he would bring them around his house, he would put out advertisements for marriage, you know, wife wanted for handsome, charming, rich, hard-working business owner with a dashing moustache. And strangely enough, over the years, these women just kept going missing. But obviously there was no cameras in those days, there was no social media, and Kish tended to pick women who were maybe from out of the area or who didn't have many family connections, who were perhaps a little more vulnerable. And this wasn't seen at the time as too suspicious from, his local neighbors, because from their perspective, he was just a guy who was kind of out on his luck. He kept dating women, he would bring one round, see her for a little while, then she would not be seen by anyone. And they might mention to Béla Kiss, oh, what happened to, that other woman that you were seeing? And he would say, yeah, she didn't like me. She thought I dressed horribly or something. And so she decided to break it off. And this excuse kind of worked for a while. Not everyone is super successful in their dating life. But after a while, the neighbors started to get a little more suspicious. They were like, all right, this is kind of ridiculous. Every single woman that comes to your house just ends up never being seen again. And they also started to see these weird barrels pop up on the property. And really just before the war started, World War I, some of these neighbors did end up reporting him to the police. And this was specifically in regard to the missing women and to these strange barrels on his property. And the local police did investigate this. They went around, they spoke to Béla, and he even showed them the barrels and said that they were just filled with alcohol or filled with chemicals or filled with gasoline, because he was anticipating this big war to start and he just wanted to stockpile them, and so he was keeping them in barrels in his garden. And the police were kind of like, okay, that's reasonable enough, that checks out, and they didn't investigate this further. So around that time, not much else happened. World War II was started. Austria-Hungary was obviously at war with Serbia. And so Béla Kiss was conscripted. He was sent out onto the front lines to fight for his country. And in around 1916, it was rumored, although there isn't too much evidence for this, but it was rumored that he had actually died on the front lines. And so because of this, his landlord thought that he was dead, and so they set about clearing out his place, throwing out all of Béla Kiss's stuff, making way for a clean, nice new property so that they could rent it out to someone else. And obviously on the property, the landlord discovered these barrels, and curiosity got the better of him. He ended up opening these barrels, and immediately this smell hit him, which was the unmistakable stench of human flesh. So he immediately contacted the police, and during their investigation, they actually came around, they saw the bodies in these barrels, and they ended up speaking with Kish's housekeeper, Mrs. Jakubek. And she said, you must have the wrong guy. Béla was lovely, he was very hardworking, and he also had a secret room on the property, which he forbade me from ever entering under any circumstances. And they were like, yeah, that's a little bit suspicious. We should probably check this room. And so she led them to the room, they cracked the door open, and inside they found all sorts of stuff, which importantly, they didn't find any bodies, but they did find a bunch of chemicals, a bunch of tools. They found empty barrels. They found biology books on, how the bodies work, where the blood vessels and the veins go around the body. They found books on poisoning, how to make poisons, how to use them, and yeah, stuff like shovels, and it's just a really suspicious room. And on the property, upon further searches, they found buried all over the grounds, under the ground, these tin barrels, and inside the tin barrels they found human remains, they found chemicals and preservatives, and this totaled to around 24 different bodies, most of whom had been strangled to death and preserved in alcohol and chemicals. And this gained Kish the dark moniker of the Hungarian Pickler. So upon discovering all of these bodies, an immediate call was put out to the army saying like, bro, if you find Béla Kiss alive, like somehow, somewhere, he should immediately be arrested and detained and possibly even just killed there on the spot. But he never was. There were also rumors that he never died in the war, and that he used the chaos and mayhem of the war to basically make his getaway. And despite potential multiple sightings over the years, these were never really confirmed, and so we don't really know whether he did die in the war, or whether he ran away, fled to another country, and just changed his name, changed his appearance perhaps. And if he did survive, whether he stopped killing then, or whether he continued to kill wherever he was living, which is just an absolutely terrifying thought. That's nice. But if you are enjoying the video, please do leave a like and subscribe to help me with my goal of 100,000 subscribers. Also, hype the video, as apparently that's a thing now. And of course, do enjoy the rest of the video. The lost treasure of the Tsars. So we covered this briefly above. If you'll recall, I briefly touched on it without really mentioning it, but we mentioned the execution of the Romanov family, and we mentioned when they were shot in the end that some of them were shot in places that deflected the bullets. And this was because, as you can imagine, the Tsars were insanely wealthy. They had lands, they had properties, they had jewels and treasures, and so when they went from their home in the west, when they were put under house arrest, when they were moved further east, they took a lot of specifically gems and jewels with them, just because these were smaller, they were easier to carry and hide, and so a lot of the family ended up having gems basically woven into their clothes, whether this was into their jacket or corset or basically their underwear, their undergarments. And so for a few of the bullets that were fired that night, they did actually end up deflecting off some of these jewels within the clothes, and they temporarily saved a few members of the family. Obviously they were all killed almost immediately after that, but that just goes to show how rich the Tsars were. And when the Bolsheviks and the communists came into power, they found that the Tsars had basically done a lot of the gathering work for them, because at the start of the war, the royal family basically got a little bit scared that, okay, what if Germany does actually kind of invade us? We don't want them getting any of their hands on any of the jewelry or treasure that's in other cities. And so they basically took all of the expensive stuff and they moved it all to their home. So when the Bolsheviks took over, it was just all there waiting for them, except when the royal family was put under house arrest, when they were moved out east. As I said, they did take a bunch of their stuff with them, mostly in the form of gems, jewels, diamonds, that sort of thing. And that was also to say nothing about the gold reserves in Russia, which were at the time the third largest gold reserves in the entire world, and it was all kept in this one city of Kazan. And there was some bamboozlery around this time, where they originally stored it all in Kazan. The communists were trying really hard to take over control of Kazan, and then when they eventually did, they went in there and there was no gold, no treasures, as really it had all been moved secretly out further east. But it didn't really make a difference. In the end, the communists ended up winning this civil war, and so they got full control over all of these riches. But what was initially over like 650 million gold rubles, which would be worth an estimated $100 billion in today's money, it was only around 250 million rubles by the time the Bolsheviks actually got their hands on it, meaning that over 450 million rubles, or around 50 to 60 billion dollars in today's money worth of gold, was then missing. And this was just one of the missing or lost treasures of Russia in World War II. You also had lots of other treasures and fine artworks, like for example the Fabergé eggs, which are each worth millions of dollars today. And you had vast amounts of personal wealth from the Tsars in the form of trinkets, jewelry, scepters, gems, that was seemingly never recovered or accounted for. A lot of the wealth was taken by the Bolsheviks when they took over and then sold to other foreign nations in order to basically liquidate all the wealth of the Tsars and to pump it back into the communist state, or probably more realistically into the pockets of the communist leaders. But as I said, there is still a vast amount of wealth and treasures from specifically the Romanovs that is today unaccounted for. We don't currently have it. We haven't seen them in many, many years, and we just don't know what ended up happening to them. And it's quite interesting because when the Romanovs were under house arrest, when they were imprisoned over in the East, very few people were actually allowed to visit them or see them or even speak with them. But some of the people who were allowed were some of the sisters or the nuns from this local monastery. And there was at least one proven example where the Mother Superior of the local Tobolsk Ivanovki monastery actually met with the Tsar's wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, while she was imprisoned. And Alexandra actually gave her a bunch of gems and jewels for safekeeping. And this Mother Superior ended up agreeing to take them. She took them out of the house, she passed them on to a few different people, and eventually they were hidden inside the Tobolsk monastery. The stash was eventually found by communists in 1933 after much interrogation and interviews and perhaps some coercion, but they did find the stash, which does confirm, the Tsars had a bunch of stuff with them and they were hoping to hide them and keep them secret. So it does raise the question of what else Alexandra might have given, any nuns or whatever that came in, because this was only like one of them that were found. We don't know if there were more instances of this. And a really cool example of a gem that I found was one diamond, which was a bloody huge diamond, almost 100 carats. And this diamond alone would have been enough to finance entire armies and ships secretly, possibly billions of dollars worth in the country that they had escaped to. And so if they managed to escape this house arrest, if they managed to flee the country and then give just this gem over to the leader of that country, they would likely have been able to rally this huge army, this huge force, or relatively big, just enough to defend the family at least, and then force their way through Europe into the safety of England. But they were obviously never able to do that. They weren't given the opportunity to escape, and so the mystery of the Tsars' lost treasures, wherever they may be today, is still an unsolved mystery to this day. The USS Cyclops will be a very short entry, but this was basically this ship which was converted for the war into carrying shipments for the US Navy. It mainly carried fuel, so coal, some other shipments, and manganese in particular, which was used as an ore for smelting steel, resulting in basically a more pure and durable form of steel. So this ship, it went down to collect a shipment of manganese in Brazil, and it was planning to bring it back up into the United States. And all seemed to be going fairly somewhat well until it had to stop off in Barbados because it was concerned about being overloaded, as at the time it was carrying a shipment of around 11,000 tons of manganese, which was well above its recommended limit of 8,000 tons. And then, after leaving Barbados, the ship was simply never seen again. And it was headed up to Baltimore in Maryland, which, let me just get a map out here. Draw a line between the two. Holy shit. I think I know what happened. And that was one of the theories, of course. But it is, in my eyes, I would say a pretty standard disappearance. It was a ship in World War I that was clearly massively overloaded in an area that is well known for having shaky waters and or storms, and there was apparently a reported heavy storm in the area at the time. So it's not too shocking. I don't think you need to be Sherlock Holmes in order to figure out what might have happened with this ship. But with the loss of this ship, that also meant the loss of around 306 passengers, or rather, sailors, workers, which made this the largest loss of life for a single US Navy ship, specifically outside of combat in all of US Navy history. the lone gunner of Flesquieres. So as you might remember, the British especially used tanks throughout World War I. Very basic tanks, mind, but still tanks. And at a place called Flesquieres, which was in France, there were hundreds of these tanks deployed, as many as like 500. And there was a little legend woven into history about a German soldier who, despite the rest of his crew fleeing and running away back behind the moving lines, he stayed at his post and single-handedly apparently destroyed 37 British tanks by himself before, of course, he was killed. And honestly, there's not a whole lot of documented evidence for this, and attempts to identify a particular soldier for this have mostly all but failed. And so it is kind of an old war rumor, a whisper, trench gossip sort of thing, but nevertheless the tanks were pretty cool. And speaking of tanks, we have the mobile personal shield, or personnel shield. And this was a shield that kind of looked like a tank, but it was, as the name suggests, basically a shield on wheels that was used very sparingly throughout World War I, where you could basically wheel around this chunk of a thing and mostly be impervious to enemy fire. And the problem was, there was a few problems, but just to name a few, it was very heavy, it was a little bit unreliable, it was slow moving, you couldn't really get it over any substantial terrain, like hills, dents in the ground, barbed wire, slightly rocky floor or road. So it was very ineffective for actually moving, and it wasn't really even that safe. Like, yes, it would protect you from a few bullets, a few shrapnel explosions, but against sustained machine gun fire, it wasn't going to hold up at all. And some of these weren't even fully enclosed, so you could still get hit from the sides, and also they could be targeted by direct shrapnel hits or mortars or artillery strikes, and so it really just wasn't worth using them, at least in any widespread sense. So yeah, a very cool piece of technology, I think. You know, you've always got to push the boundaries in wars like this, but yeah, at the same time, not really that effective. The Spanish flu spread. So the Spanish flu was just awful. It was a flu that spread just towards the end of the war, and it affected roughly 1/3 of the entire world, killing an estimated 50 to 100 million people worldwide, which, to put into perspective, you know, in its totality, as gruesome and brutal and horrific as it was, World War I itself only killed around 15 to 20 million people. So then, after all of that killing, after all of that brutality, just when the people thought that they were putting an end to this war, getting a break from all the death, this flu then comes along and kills 3 to 5 times as many people as this war did. So it was incredibly brutal. It spread partly due to the conditions of the war, you know, due to the cramped spaces of the soldiers and the fact that people were being shipped all around the world, you know, back to their own countries. So perhaps an outbreak in Germany would spread over to France, and then when the British Indian soldiers went back to British India or back to Australia or to New Zealand, that would further spread the flu, meaning it was kind of a worldwide thing. And due to the way this particular flu worked, it tended to be worse on younger people with better immune systems. Because what would happen is people would catch the flu, their body would kind of go into overdrive trying to defend against the flu, and then this would cause inflammatory problems, basically having the immune system kill itself. So very terrifying, honestly, a very scary flu, and particularly strange that it killed younger people at a higher rate than either very young people like children or older people, and that was the Spanish flu. Anastasia Grave is a reference to the fact that during the execution of the Romanov family, Anastasia and Alexei, the 2 youngest children of the Tsars, were buried separately from the other family members. This was, at the time, apparently an attempt to basically confuse anyone who found the bodies. You know, if they found these 2 people on their own, they might not think they were connected to the royal family at all, which it was a pretty weak attempt, quite honestly, but that is why these bodies were separated. But partly because of this, there were rumors ever since the Romanovs were killed, that Anastasia in particular had escaped, had made it to America, for example, or to Britain, or to somewhere in the Nordic countries, and was laying low, had a small job somewhere, had changed her hair color, had been learning an English or American accent. And as I said, that was part of the rumors at the time. But since then, all of the bodies have been dug up, they've been tested for DNA, and they were all confirmed to be the Romanov family, with each body they found sadly linking up to each family member, meaning that Anastasia was found buried here, despite all of the rumors over the past 100 or so years. And in fact, I even covered a alternate history in one of my alternate history Iceberg videos, exploring what the world might look like if Anastasia was confirmed to have escaped, and to possibly bring back the Romanov family into Russia, which is a very interesting alt history. And if you like alternate histories, absolutely check out the Iceberg, which I will link down below. Mata Hari was a woman who was born as Margaretha or Margaretha Gertrude Zell. This was in the Netherlands in 1876. She had a fairly uneventful younger life, I would say, but when she was 18 years old, she responded to a newspaper advertisement by a Dutch army captain, Rudolf MacLeod, who was advertising asking for a wife, and they apparently hit it off quite well. They were soon married, and she was then living with Rudolf in Indonesia, and eventually ended up having 2 kids with him. So time goes on, Rudolf ends up being a womanizer, an abuser, constantly cheating on her with the maid, drinking every day, and eventually the two ended up getting a divorce. So Margaretha moves back to Paris, and she starts working and performing in a circus, and she was well known for her exotic dances. And it was around this time that she started to formally, kind of publicly take on the persona and name of Mata Hari, meaning the eye of the day in Indonesian, and obviously performing as an erotic dancer and model. This then caught the media's eye, and she was soon performing for the high and mighty, you know, the rich, the nobility, and this was all around 1903, 1904, so a good 10 years before the start of World War I. Then World War I does start, and since the Netherlands is a neutral country, this allowed Mata Hari to travel around mostly unbothered. You know, she was allowed into France, obviously she was allowed into the Netherlands, also into Britain, also into Germany, and she was mostly, as I said, unbothered. And this, it was spotted by some higher-ups, made her an incredible valuable asset to the war, and particularly to the French. And the French basically took her aside, and for a few reasons which we won't really dive into, she was at the time dating a Russian guy. This Russian guy was fighting in France, he was injured on the front lines, and the only way they would let her see him was if she agreed to do some covert work for the French. So she agreed to this. She went into Germany to do some sexy dancing for some prominent Germans, you know, captains, commanders, politicians, etc. And 2, if she could, try and get some information from them that the French could use. So she ended up doing all this, but while she was over there, she accepted a large payment from the Germans. So at this point, it wasn't entirely clear where her loyalties lay. Like, maybe she was taking this money from the Germans in order to not be suspicious to them. Maybe she was doing that to line her own pockets and she was still on the side of France. Or maybe she had taken this as a bribe from the Germans in order to spy on France and do like a reverse spy sort of thing. And it's not really clear exactly why she took the money, for what purpose, exactly where her loyalties lay. She was a bit like Snape in Harry Potter, I guess. And at the time, during all this, she did exchange some information. You know, she gave some French secrets or information over to Germany. She gave some German information over to France, with her apparently telling each side that, yes, I did give them some information about you, but that was really just to gain their trust. Like, I'm really on your side. And so Around this time, Germany sent a coded radio message to Berlin describing in detail Mata Hari and saying that she was a great spy for spying with us, spying on the French. She gave us loads of information, and they described her in a way where this description could only be Mata Hari. And they didn't call her by name, but they referred to her as Agent H21. And so, as I said, the Germans sent this message over to Berlin. The French intercepted it, even though the message was encoded. The Germans chose to use a coding system that they knew the French had already cracked. So it's very strange. We're not entirely sure why the Germans did this, whether the Germans knew that she was spying for France, and so they just wanted to get rid of her, to rat her out to the French, but in this more indirect manner. And so they used a description that only could have been Mata Hari. They complimented her and said, yes, she's spying for the Germans, the silly French don't even know about it. And they encoded it in a way that they knew the French could uncode or decode. And so that is basically what happened. The French intercepted this message, they decoded it, they realized that they were referencing Mata Hari, and so at the next possible available time, they ended up arresting Mata Hari, where she was accused basically of espionage. And even though there was no real physical or documented evidence for this espionage, they said that the information that she had given to the Germans cost thousands of lives of French individuals, French citizens, French soldiers, and so she was put to death via firing squad. And it was thought also that the French might have been using her as some sort of scapegoat. So these tactics that they might have tried, maybe they failed, maybe they were stupid decisions, but by sentencing Mata Hari for espionage, they were able to say, it was a good decision, but obviously the Germans didn't fall for it because you leaked the information first to the Germans, and that is why we failed the mission or the battle or what have you. So she was soon convicted for these crimes, and it was said that she was the cause for the deaths of 50,000 soldiers, which was really just an absurd number with no basis or grounding for. And on the day of her firing squad, she showed one last act of badassery and refused the blindfold that they typically offer on a firing squad execution. And just before she was killed, she blew all the soldiers a kiss, and then she was shot to death with rifles. So was she really guilty of all this? It's hard to say. She could have been double crossing, triple crossing sort of thing, 4D chess, but it's not clear that this was even agreed upon by either side at the time. So that is the story of Mata Hari. A Bible shielded a man is a reference to the many occasions throughout World War I where, as it says, a Bible literally shielded a man, often from severe injury or even death. And they were normally pocket Bibles, kept in the breast pockets of their uniforms. And there were a few actual fairly well documented, fairly well noted occasions of this. Some of them being, for example, Frederick Peel, or Pale, whose Bible stopped a German machine gun round, Leslie Friston, whose Bible stopped 2 bullets, and Leonard Knight, George Vinnell, and the list just goes on. And these Bibles were often then kept as family heirlooms. They were very, very important to the individuals. They were seen as a sign of God directly protecting them, and sometimes even caused these soldiers to fully devote their lives to Christianity and to Jesus, with some of them becoming long-term missionaries. Tier 4, Who Shot the Red Baron, is a very interesting reference to the Red Baron, who was this guy, Manfred von Richthofen, who was dubbed the Ace of Aces when it came to flying in World War I. He was reportedly responsible single-handedly for over 80 aerial battle victories and for taking out countless Allied planes and pilots, with obviously his plane being painted bright red, hence the name Red Baron, which striked fear into the hearts and minds of the Allied pilots. And he wasn't just always alone. He did have his crew, you know, his gang, and he encouraged them to also paint their planes various colors, and for some of them to also paint their planes red, so that when he was in the air, it wasn't, you know, super obvious that there was one red plane, and so everyone would just shoot that one red plane. He didn't want that, so he had a few different red planes flying with him at a time, and this gang or group became known as the Flying Circus due to them obviously flying and to the bright colors of their planes, which incidentally, that's what the Monty Python's Flying Circus was actually named after. But on the German side, he was an absolute legend. On the Allied side, he was obviously an absolute terror, and the Red Baron was eventually taken down by, we don't exactly know who. The main guy who was originally suspected of taking down the Red Baron was a man named Captain Arthur Roy Brown of the British Royal Air Force, who was flying around chasing the Red Baron in an aerial battle, and just as the Red Baron just as he went down, that's when Captain Brown was fighting him, so it was just assumed that he was the one who took him down. But after analyzing all this and investigating it with bullet trajectories, they determined that it was very unlikely that it was Captain Brown, and it was very much more likely that it was a machine gunner on the ground, which for that there were a few different people, machine gunners that it could have been, but it was never really pinpointed on an individual, and so the mystery still remains of really who took out the Red Baron. And so I think just a very cool entry. I love the idea and the style of the character, and even though he may technically be a bad guy, I think he had skill, he had style, he had gall and bravery, and he was just really representing his country. So yeah, what a lad. The Angel of the Mons, or Mons if you're not French. But this entry involves a battle called the Battle of the Mons, which was really a very cool battle and very pivotal, especially for the start of World War I. And as you know, Germany is fighting France. They are fighting them on the front lines. Germany then forces its way into neutral Belgium, which causes Britain to go, hey, wait a minute, you can't park there, mate. You can't do that. And so they send in the BEF, or British Expeditionary Force, over to France and Belgium in order to push Germany back. And this British force is like some of the best Britain has to offer at the time. And they jump right in, heading through France into Belgium, and they basically push the Germans out. And this is where we start the Battle of Mons. And Mons was a city in Belgium, and it is where the Brits and the Germans basically then came to blows. And as I said, it's a really cool battle. The Brits were destroying the Germans, with accounts from Germans that they thought the Brits were actually using machine guns just because of how fast and accurate the Brits were. But really, they were actually just using regular old rifles, which shows just how skilled this particular British army group was. And they fought off the Germans, killing around 3 times as many Germans as the Brits lost. But in the end, the force of the Germans was just too much. They had too many numbers against the British, and so eventually the British soldiers had to make their retreat. But retreat at this time in this particular battle was very risky, and it meant turning your back on the enemy, meaning they could flank you, they could advance into different positions around you, they could shoot you in the back. It was and still is a very risky thing to do. But it is said that just as they were retreating, according to some witnesses, a bright light engulfed the area. And some say it was a group of like ethereal, angelic archers who fired arrows at the Germans, blowing up their, trenches or what have you. And others say that it was a brightly lit cloud or fog. And still others say that it was just complete nonsense. That it was either a hallucination or some rumor or a bit of war propaganda, and that it never actually really happened. But either way, whether it did or didn't happen, the BEF successfully retreated, and while they did lose a fair few men in this retreat, it was not honestly as bad as it potentially could have been. So, myth or legend, mass psychosis or delusion, aliens perhaps, or in fact divine intervention. Let me know what you think about this entry and what actually happened down below. Trench rats were absolutely horrible. But as you can imagine, as I spin you a tale, so picture the scene. You're a soldier in World War I in these horrible conditions down in the trenches. You know, it's cold, it's wet, you haven't slept properly or eaten properly in days. Your comrades and brothers are being blown up and shot. There is constant artillery fire dropping on you from above, from nearby. Your ears are just ringing. It's absolutely hell. There's diseases going around the trench, and on top of that, you have these rats that are as big as cats by some accounts, completely flooding the trenches, nibbling you as you sleep, spreading rat disease. You know, they all have rat desire, and they're living off your food, off disposed food, and also off fallen soldiers that they can find basically anywhere in no man's land in the trenches. And they are an absolute menace, with one pair of rats being able to produce almost 900 offspring in a single year. So it was obviously a major problem. And they would do shit like eat candles, which doesn't even seem like a thing rats should want to do. Like, it's a bloody candle, but it feels like they were just torturing the soldiers. You know, you would set up lights all in the trenches, the rats would come up, eat the candle would fall on the floor, go out. They would eat their way into cans of food, and especially if you had just normal dry food that wasn't protected, like as if these soldiers needed even more suffering. Sergeant Stubby. Now, what I'm about to tell you is absolutely amazing, and it might sound made up, but it is all completely true. And this is the story of little Stubby, who was a dog, a bull terrier mix, that apparently had no owner, and in 1917 wandered into a military training grounds in Connecticut, where he was found and later adopted by Private Robert Conroy. He was then smuggled aboard the SS Minnesota, which was a US Navy ship headed to France, and this apparently went against all regulations at the time, but they got away with it by hiding him inside of an overcoat. Then they arrived in France, and it is here that little Stubby first sees combat, fighting at Chemin des Dames, which I'm not too sure if I got that pronunciation right, but he was there fighting with his fellow soldiers under constant fire for over a month. He then participated in a raid at Seicheprey, where he suffered a wound in his front leg, and this was when he was hit by a grenade. And he was also injured by breathing in mustard gas, but then in July of that year fought in a few fairly major battles, including the Second Battle of the Marne and the capture of Chateau Thierry. He lived around these soldiers. He would constantly sniff out mustard gas before anyone else could detect it, and then he would alert the soldiers of this, or he would hear the whistle of artillery shells dropping, and again this was before the soldiers were able to detect it. So he would hear very, very subtly, he would start barking, he would run for cover, all the soldiers would follow him, and then these bombs would drop. So he saved many lives doing that as well. And, I mean, the list honestly just goes on here, but he would often sniff out wounded soldiers in no man's land, bringing them medical supplies and leading medics to their location. And he even at one point sniffed out a German soldier who was sneaking around their trenches, mapping them out, and it is said that he chased the soldier, he harassed him, and he held him until help arrived. Like, I am just absolutely in love with this dog. And for all of this, he was actually promoted to sergeant, being the first ever dog to receive a military rank in the US. And after all of this, after the war ended, Stubby returned to the US with Conroy until he sadly died in 1926, being memorialized as America's most decorated war dog. And if you do nothing else today, can you at least please leave a #Stubby down in the comments below? Thank you, and that is all. The Cottingley Fairies are these very obviously real fairies. Like, I don't see how anyone could even say otherwise. But they were photographed by 9-year-old Frances Griffiths, and that's a bloody hard name to say, Griffiths, and 16-year-old Elsie Wright, who were cousins living together in Cottingley in England. And it was just before the end of World War I that these two girls apparently saw these fairies in their garden and decided to take some photographs of them. And this was, as I said, in 1917, but shortly after the war in 1920, Elsie's mother showed the photographs at her local Theosophical Society meeting. And Theosophy is kind of like a spiritual religion. It's kind of like Christianity, but more spiritual, you know, slightly magical, slightly fanciful sort of thing. And she showed it there, where they were really impressed by these fairies. And so then this somehow got around to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you know, the guy who wrote Sherlock. And he was so pleased with them that he ended up publishing the photographs alongside an article in the Strand magazine, and said that he can completely vouch for their authenticity, and that he believed that they were a true sign and evidence of spirituality, of God, of magic. And from there they just became more and more popular. And this was obviously just after World War I, when everyone at the time was, as you can imagine, kind of heartbroken, sad, tired, injured. Most families had lost someone, be it a son or a father or a cousin. Like, it was a really crummy time. And I think this little spark of magic, you know, this childishness, this awe, beauty, mystery, divine, was perhaps what everyone in Britain wanted and ultimately deserved. But it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that these two girls, now, you know, middle-aged women, hinted that yes, perhaps these may have been a hoax, and they may or may not have been created with cardboard cutouts and drawings and designs and photographic trickery. Who would have thought? And so to this day, these fairies remain a, I think, little blip of magic in the dark, dark times that was post-World War I Britain. Mercy Dog. So, you know how we just covered little Sergeant Stubby? Well, he wasn't the only dog that served in the First World War. In fact, around 10 to 20,000 dogs served in World War I, and they were often known as mercy dogs. And reading about these is just so bloody cool. Like, I absolutely love dogs. But these dogs were trained specifically for this purpose. Like, they were actually bred and put into school in Britain, which a few of them were called the British War Dog School. And then they were shipped out to the front lines to live with and help with the soldiers who were out there fighting. And this wasn't just Britain, this was France as well, also Australia, New Zealand, but also it wasn't limited to just the Allies. The Germans also had their own mercy dogs, and they would often head out into no man's land, you know, sniffing along with their little dog snouts, and they would move silently, sometimes at night, and they would find and locate wounded soldiers. And these dogs didn't just come empty-handed. They carried these little packs on their back, and they were filled with alcohol, with water, with first aid kits, and so any soldiers that they found would be able to stitch up perhaps minor wounds. Maybe if they had a bullet that hit them somewhere, they could disinfect it with the alcohol, they could sew themselves back up. And if they found a wounded soldier who could be saved, they were trained to rip off a piece of its uniform or to take a piece from the soldier giving it to them, and then they would head back to base, and when the medics came out to help the soldiers, these dogs would lead the way, and they would lead them directly to some of the wounded soldiers. And if the man they found couldn't be saved, they would just sit there with them in their final moments, providing softness, providing warmth, and providing the dog comfort which we have all known to grow and love. They would sometimes as well be in the right conditions to be able to drag a man to safety. And as I said, with around 10 to 20,000 mercy dogs serving in the war, they saved an estimated, it is thought, 6 to 8,000 men. And for some honorable mentions, you know, some especially good boys, there was Prusco, which was a French dog credited with saving more than 100 men in a single battle. He dragged multiple men off to safety, all on his own, which is just insane. There was Stiff or Stife, who was a German dog awarded with the Iron Cross, which is a German military medal for bravery, after, and I think I might cry, but after he ran out, he dragged a wounded lieutenant back to safety under active gunfire, despite this dog being shot twice and having both of his bloody front legs being broken. He dragged his master, this lieutenant, back to safety. They were both then rescued, they were both operated on, and both this dog, Stife, and his master ended up surviving. There was also a French dog named Captain, who located 30 wounded soldiers in a single day. And when I was reading this, I thought it said that he wounded 30 soldiers in a single day, which that would have been a completely different achievement. That would have been like a John Wick dog or something, which is kind of ironic in and of itself. And finally, our little man, Sergeant Stubby, who was not officially trained as a mercy dog, but did a fantastic job all the same. I bloody love dogs. The Florentine Diamond is one of those pieces of jewelry or treasures lost to time, because it was, before World War I, part of the Austrian crown jewels and passed down through the generations. And this gorgeous yellow 137 carat diamond that, after Austria-Hungary lost World War I, was taken along with a bunch of other precious jewels and gems by Karl I, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. And this is when he left the throne, he abdicated his position, and he went to live with his family in Switzerland. But after this, the diamond seems to more or less have disappeared. There are some claims that it was stolen by someone, during the move, and then either sold off to someone in America or in Britain in order to raise money for him and his family. But either way, we don't know what happened to it. We don't know if it was lost, or if it was cut down into smaller pieces and then sold, or if it was just sold as one big piece. The Passchendaele Mud Drownings. So we've gone over a few things in World War I so far, and a few of the horrors, the trenches, the running over the top into oncoming machine gun fire, diseases, non-stop artillery, bloody rats. But to add to that list, there is mud, like the worst mud you can possibly imagine. And the worst of these muds was perhaps in the Battle of Passchendaele, sometimes known as the Third Battle of Ypres, where near Ypres in Belgium, this particular area was quite low lying, so it was the opposite of the top of a hill, and that meant that all the other higher areas around the area, all of the water flow and rivers and canals and streams, they would eventually naturally converge in this area. And it didn't help that a bunch of these streams were being blown up, so the water was being redirected. It also didn't help that the area was facing its worst rainfall in about 30 years, which is just like, yeah, why not? And so very, very wet conditions mixed with artillery bombings all over the place created an absolute wasteland of mud. So you absolutely could not walk in this area. And even when they put down these kind of wooden panels all over the place, there were still accounts of soldiers either slipping on them and then drowning in the mud, or, you lose your way, you're perhaps walking this at night, you take just one wrong step and you're in this crazy suction of mud. You're up to your waist in puddly mud, and you end up just sinking and drowning, with multiple accounts of people actually falling into them and just being swallowed whole. So you can imagine you're being shot at in these crazy conditions. Maybe you're running away, you're panicking, and then you fall into the mud. No one else around can really help you. Either they're shot as well or whatever, and you may or may not have been shot. You may or may not be bleeding or injured, but you are just stuck in this cold mud, slowly sinking as the day gets darker and darker, and it is just absolutely horrifying to imagine. And I don't even need to remind you that there were rats all over the place. And one of the worst noted examples of this was in the first Battle of Passchendaele, where a whole group of New Zealand soldiers ended up getting trapped in the mud. They were pinned down by German gunfire, and so they couldn't even really move. And as it was raining, over 840 of them were left there in the mud, either dead or dying on that day. Bonus entry, Khudadad Khan. So this was actually the first Indian soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery. And this was while fighting against the Germans in the Battle of Ypres. And his story was just insane. He was part of a roughly 4 to 6 man machine gun crew, and as you can imagine, when you're in a crew, you might have 1 or 2 people firing the gun, swapping in and out, taking turns for various reasons. You might have a few defending your position, you might have a few more reloading ammo or just moving bits around. But at this point in the battle, all of his allies were dead. The Germans had killed most of the people around this entire area, and so it just left him alone on this machine gun versus large groups of Germans. And any normal, sane person might say, look, I'm not winning this. Perhaps it's best to either retreat or to just surrender to the Germans. But Khudadad Khan was not just a normal man. Despite being wounded quite badly, he still gave the Germans hell, completely raining fire on their positions whenever they tried to come out, and doing everything himself, reloading the gun himself, ducking for cover, and then keeping up the gunfire. And he was able to do this consistently until Allied reinforcements arrived and further secured their position. So single-handedly, he was able to hold the position and to stop German advancement, and all of this while being alone and badly injured. So yeah, hell yes, this guy deserves a medal. Tier 5, the Lost Battalion. So this is quite a long topic, and it's an epic story, and there are full-length videos about this that you can find online, which I would highly recommend if it sounds interesting to you. But this was towards the tail end of World War I, after the Americans arrived. And at the time, the British, the French, and the Americans, and obviously many other nations, but they were basically fighting back along the Germans, forcing them back into Germany, and the plan was that all of these divisions here would make a push against the Germans, and by doing this they would then gain some ground. The only problem was, even though it didn't really seem like a problem at the time, but Major Charles W. Whittlesey, who was in charge of the 77th Division, he made his way forward. He faced surprisingly little pushback from the Germans, and after a while he found that he had gained a surprising amount of space in a surprising amount of time, with very few casualties in his division of around 650 men. But what Whittlesey and his men didn't know at the time was that he and his men had just pushed through the German forces, and they were now behind enemy lines because the route that he and his men took was a completely unseen, unknown gap in the German defenses, which neither the Allied forces or the Germans had initially noticed. So his division kind of buckled down, they set up their defenses. The Germans didn't yet know that they were there, and even though they were at their objective, they soon started to notice that neither of its flanks had successfully pushed up. And slowly, as the Germans started to notice him and his men being there, he was then trapped behind enemy lines with no flank support and with Germans on all sides. So as I said, they did the next best sensible thing, and they quickly dug in. With some accounts, this one by Private Julius Langer of Company H, and he says, "I was alone in the hole I dug. I had only a mess kit spoon and a bayonet to dig with, but it is wonderful how fast one can dig when bullets are whistling around. There was dirt flying in all directions for a few minutes, and it was everyone for themselves. And And another account by Lieutenant Eager, the lieutenant in charge of G Company had dug him out a nice foxhole, and he was sitting down there and it looked like he was safe. And Lieutenant Harrington, who went up there with me, and I was standing there talking to him, he was sitting down in his foxhole with rock piled up in front of him, which he had dug out in digging his foxhole, and it looked like good protection. While we were standing there, a German grenade thrown from above the road on top of the hill came down there and landed right on the rocks and just cut his face to pieces. Lieutenant Harrington got a slug through the shoulder of it, but I did not get a scratch, although I was standing just as close as any of them. I took over the company from then on, being the ranking officer. And so you can imagine what it was like at this time. They then sent out a small force of 58 men back along the way that they had just come, and they were basically trying to see if there was a path out back to the Allied lines, or just to assess the situation, or to pass on a message sort of thing, or to just give this division some intel perhaps on German positions. But it ended up being an absolute bloodbath. They stumbled across many Germans. Machine gun fire hit them from all sides. You know, the flanks, the front, the back. There was artillery from above. And by the time the group returned to the rest of the division, 40 of the 58 that originally went out there were now dead. And there's even this quote from one of the soldiers themselves about this short mission. On the morning of October 3rd, just before daylight, my company was ordered back to the position where on the preceding day we had assaulted and driven the Germans from their trenches. And that left companies D and F. Our mission was to bring those two companies up to the rest of the 1st and 2nd battalions of the 308th Infantry. As we started back, we were attacked by a machine gun on the hill on our right. This machine gun was silenced and the crew taken prisoner. Then we proceeded on toward our objective, and just before we reached it, we were fired upon from each flank and from the front. The Germans were to the right of us and to the left of us, and to the front of us. They attempted to close in behind us, but a small portion of my company, myself and 17 others, succeeded in fighting our way through the lines behind us, while another portion succeeded in pushing its way towards the trench. I reported to Major Whittlesey upon my return what I had found. And so, with no real way to leave this area, they had been surrounded on all sides, the battalion decided just to dig in and to fight for as long as possible. They were bombarded with artillery, although thankfully due to their position, which was on the side of this ravine, it was rather hard for the Germans to actually accurately hit them. But they also faced constant machine gun fire, they faced barrages of grenades thrown at them from all angles, and over the next 6 days, it was a mad effort just to stay alive. They fought back valiantly, not surrendering, and not giving the Germans an easy time either. They sent out runners or messengers. You know, think of them kind of like the scouts of old. And these were people who were really trained in terms of cardio. They were very swift movers, and they also had really good senses of direction. They were able to read maps incredibly well. And the plan was to send out runners back along the way they came and to give a message to their allies that they had broken through the enemy lines, they were still alive, and that they needed some reinforcements. But sadly, out of all the runners that they sent out, none of them ever returned. They also tried sending out messenger pigeons, with the first pigeon reading, "Many wounded, we cannot evacuate." The second read, "Men are suffering, can support be sent?" But none of these messages actually ended up going to the Allies, because every time they were sent up, the Germans would spot them and they ended up shooting them out of the sky. And it was during this time that the Allied troops were actually firing mortars and artillery down on Whittlesey and his men. And this was because, as you can see from this image of the landscape, it was very hard to see through, very hard to pinpoint an actual location, and since none of the messages had got back to the Allies, from the Allies' perspective, this division was probably already dead or captured, and so these artillery strikes were just being fired down on the Germans. But as a result of these friendly artillery strikes, there were over 110 casualties and 30 deaths of Whittlesey's men. And that was when Whittlesey sent out his last and only remaining messenger pigeon, and he was named Cher Ami. And he wrote on this message, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." And little Cher Ami, that bloody great pigeon, he flew, and he flew fast. Out into the open, the Germans did spot this bird. They tried shooting the bird, they tried taking it down with shrapnel fire, and despite being shot through the breast and blinded in one eye and having his right leg almost severed by a bullet or piece of shrapnel, despite suffering all of these injuries mid-flight, little Cher successfully managed to make it back to base and to relay this message to the Allies, who of course immediately ceased all artillery fire in the area. And again, I don't want you to think that this division was just biding their time. They were just, dug in, just holding out until they were rescued. Like, they were absolutely fighting for their lives, giving the Germans hell. Like, if they weren't fighting back, the Germans would have overrun this position days ago. But if the Germans tried to approach to launch grenades into them, they had a good chance of getting shot themselves. If they tried to machine gun fire onto this position, they better have been ready to take some fire back themselves. And so the bravery and gall of these men in this terrible position can absolutely not be overstated. But during this whole time, after days of being out here, Whittlesey had lost around 50% of his original 650-man division, and only by aggressively and bravely fighting back against the Germans were they able to hold their ground. But they were also running out of food and water and supplies, and so decisions were then made from the base to have pilots drop supply crates down for the division, which, as you can imagine, flying planes this low over known German areas, over active machine guns, was really a last-ditch approach. Like, a lot of these pilots should absolutely be commended for what they did. But they were, in the end, able to drop these supply crates. The only problem being that they dropped them in German areas. So they weren't quite able to make it to this particular spot. And in these attempts, multiple aircrafts were shot down by the Germans. And so after days of being under siege, of being starving and thirsty, some of these men, a group of 9, desperately, without authorization from the major, they went out to try and secure this supply package. And of these 9 men, 5 of them were killed almost immediately. It seems like they were ambushed by German machine gun fire, and the remaining 4 were injured at various levels of severity, with one particular soldier, one Private Lowell Hollingshead, being captured and being taken prisoner. And he was taken prisoner by a man named Heinrich Fritz Prinz, who spoke great English, to Holly's surprise, as he had actually lived in America for very many years. But he basically deep down had no real hate in his heart for Americans. He had lived there after all for many years, and he knew that Germany was soon losing this war. It seemed to be inevitable in his eyes. And so, partly out of an act of mercy, partly to stop more deaths on both the German and the American side, he ended up offering an olive branch to Whittlesey and his men. He told Hollingshead, "I will allow you to go back to your men, your brothers in arms, but you must take this message with you, and it is to go directly to your major." So Hollingshead then agrees to this. He makes his way back to the division, and he hands Major Charles Whittlesey this message. And I was going to do this in a German accent, but maybe I shouldn't. Und maybe I should. Und the message read, Hollingshead has been taken prisoner by us on October. He refused the German intelligence officer every answer to his questions and is quite an honorable fellow, doing honor to his fatherland in the strictest sense of the word. He has been charged against his will, believing in doing wrong to his country, in carrying forward this present letter to the officer in charge of the 2nd Battalion of the 77th Division, with the purpose to recommend this commander to surrender with his forces, as it would be quite useless to resist anymore in view of the present conditions. The suffering of your wounded men can be heard over here in the German lines, and we are appealing to your human sentiments. A white flag shown by one of your men will tell us that you agree to these conditions. Please treat the Hollingshead as an honorable man. He is quite a soldier. We envy you. And that was a lot of fun, but I will probably never do a German accent again. I don't even know what Germans sound like. And they then led Hollingshead back to the outskirts, which was nearby the rest of his men. They blindfolded him, they led him there, and then they gave him this letter, they gave him the white flag, and they sent him back to his men, ensuring that no Germans in the area fire upon him. And when Whittlesey read this message, he decided to not surrender, to not even reply to the message, but rather to keep on fighting. And so they did. They were eventually flanked and rescued by their advancing Allied soldiers and troops. And in the end, of the 650 men who went in behind enemy lines just a few days ago, only 194 of them survived without any major injuries. So it is a wild story that I would highly recommend watching a long documentary on if it sounds interesting to you, which I promise it is very interesting. And Hollingshead actually, after the war, made contact with this German lieutenant who captured him, and after being dubbed as an honorable man by this Heinrich Prince, the two men actually stayed in contact for quite a few years up until the start of World War II, while the head of this division, Major Whittlesey, was one of only 7 men awarded with the Medal of Honor, but was likely extremely traumatized by this event, and he even blamed himself for firstly getting into this situation and for not being able to save more of his men, which I think he was being pretty harsh on himself, honestly. A lot of the men there actually thanked him for their survival. He was doing just exactly what he had been instructed to do, what he had planned to do, but it was just that either side had failed on their mission, and so they weren't able to cover his flanks. And in retrospect, they actually did incredibly well at holding their position, as saving as many men as they did, and actually in the push by the Allies later on in order to save this division, that kind of gave the rest of the battalions more motivation, more oomph in order to push the Germans back, and this resulted in them actually capturing more ground. But as I said, he blamed himself quite badly for the deaths of his men, and so in just 1921, a few years after the war, he was on board a ship heading to Havana, and after having dinner one evening, he walked out onto the deck alone at night and was never seen again. They later found a written note within his room, which was addressed to his former executive officer, that simply read, "Take care of the boys for me." So an insane story and event filled with confusion, bravery, gall, brutality, death, desperation, suffering, and sorrow and woe, and also an incredibly brave pigeon. Cher Ami. So we did just cover the story of this very brave pigeon, but just a few more little tidbits to add about Cher Ami. The name itself obviously means basically dearest friend in French, which is very cute. And also he was one of 600 homing pigeons bred and raised in England and donated to the US Army in order to use as messenger pigeons. And when Whittlesey and his men were trapped in this very tricky spot, and Cher Ami, his last messenger pigeon, was sent out to relay this call for help, Cher Ami flew around 25 miles in under half an hour, which is just insane. And this was through constant machine gun fire, shrapnel explosions. As we mentioned, he got pierced through the breast, he was blinded in one eye, one of his legs was almost completely blown off, like it was literally just hanging on by a tendon, and that leg was actually the leg with the message on it. So if that had gone, the message probably would have just fallen off. And so when you think about it, Cher Ami basically single-handedly saved the rest of these men. Like, at least 200 men owe their lives to this little pigeon. And after delivering this message, after sustaining all of these injuries, the army medics actually operated on him, saved his life, and replaced his leg with a wooden leg, with him returning to the United States shortly afterwards. He was seen as an avian hero. He received the Croix de Guerre, or Cross of War, from the French government, and sadly died just a few months after returning to America, with him eventually being stuffed and preserved and mounted to stand tall for all to see, and is currently available to go visit and to pay respects to in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And that is all we have time for. The third and final part of this iceberg will be out in just a few days, so make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss that when it comes out. It is the deepest part of the iceberg that has the most strange, amazing, heartfelt, unusual, unheard of entries that I am sure you will absolutely enjoy. Wherever you are, I hope you are having a lovely day and or night, and as always, thanks for watching.